Book 3, Section 8 of On Duties by Cicero, translated by Walter Miller. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jeffrey Edwards. 8. Now, when we meet with expediency in some specious form or other, we cannot help being influenced by it. But if upon closer inspection one sees that there is some immorality connected with what presents the appearance of expediency, then one is not necessarily to sacrifice expediency, but to recognize that there can be no expediency where there is immorality. But if there is nothing so repugnant to nature as immorality, for nature demands right and harmony and consistency, and abhors their opposites, and if nothing is so thoroughly in accord with nature as expediency, then surely expediency and immorality cannot coexist in one and the same object. Again, if we are born for moral rectitude, and if that is either the only thing worth seeking, as Zeno thought, or at least to be esteemed as infinitely outweighing everything else, as Aristotle holds, then it necessarily follows that the morally right is either the sole good or the supreme good. Now, that which is good is certainly expedient; consequently, that which is morally right is also expedient. Thus it is the error of men who are not strictly upright to seize upon something that seems to be expedient, and straightway to dissociate that from the question of moral right. To this error the assassin's dagger, the poisoned cup, the forged wills owe their origin. This gives rise to theft, embezzlement of public funds, exploitation, and plundering of provincials and citizens. This engenders also the lust for excessive wealth, for despotic power, and finally for making oneself king even in the midst of a free people; and anything more atrocious or repulsive than such a passion cannot be conceived. For with a false perspective they see the material rewards, but not the punishment. I do not mean the penalty of the law, which they often escape, but the heaviest penalty of all, their own demoralization. Away then with questioners of this sort, for their whole tribe is wicked and ungodly, who stop to consider whether to pursue the course which they see is morally right, or to stain their hands with what they know is crime. For there is guilt in their very deliberation, even though they never reach the performance of the deed itself. Those actions, therefore, should not be considered at all, the mere consideration of which is itself morally wrong. Furthermore, in any such consideration we must banish any vain hope and thought that our action may be covered up and kept secret; for if we have only made some real progress in the study of philosophy, we ought to be quite convinced that, even though we may escape the eyes of gods and men, we must still do nothing that savors of greed, or of injustice, of lust, or of intemperance. 9. By way of illustrating this truth, Plato introduces the familiar story of Gyges. Once upon a time the earth opened in consequence of heavy rains. Gyges went down into the chasm and saw, so the story goes, a horse of bronze. In its side was a door. On opening this door, he saw the body of a dead man of enormous size, with a gold ring upon his finger. He removed this, and put it on his own hand, and then repaired to an assembly of the shepherds, for he was a shepherd of the king. As often as he turned the bezel of the ring inwards towards the palm of his hand, he became invisible to every one, while he himself saw everything; but as often as he turned it back to its proper position, he became visible again. And so, with the advantage which the ring gave him, he debauched the queen, and with her assistance he murdered his royal master, and removed all those who he thought stood in his way, without any one's being able to detect him in his crimes. Thus, by virtue of the ring, he shortly rose to be king of Lydia. Now, suppose a wise man had just such a ring, he would not imagine that he was free to do wrong any more than if he did not have it; for good men aim to secure not secrecy, but the right. And yet, on this point, certain philosophers, who are not at all vicious, but who are not very discerning, declare that the story related by Plato is fictitious and imaginary, as if he affirmed that it was actually true or even possible. But the force of the illustration of the ring is this: if nobody were to know or even to suspect the truth, when you do anything to gain riches, or power, or sovereignty, or sensual gratification, if your act should be hidden for ever from the knowledge of gods and men, would you do it? The condition, they say, is impossible. Of course it is; but my question is, if that were possible, which they declare to be impossible, what, pray, would one do? They press their point with right boorish obstinacy. They assert that it is impossible, and insist upon it. They refuse to see the meaning of my words, if possible; for when we ask what they would do if they could escape detection, we are not asking whether they can escape detection, but we put them as it were upon the rack. Should they answer that, if impunity were assured, they would do what was most to their selfish interest, that would be a confession that they are criminally minded. Should they say that they would not do so, they would be granting that all things in and of themselves immoral should be avoided. But let us now return to our theme. 10. Many cases oftentimes arise to perplex our minds with a specious appearance of expediency. The question raised in these cases is not whether moral rectitude is to be sacrificed to some considerable advantage, for that would of course be wrong, but whether the apparent advantage can be secured without moral wrong. When Brutus deposed his colleague Collatinus from the consular office, his treatment of him might have been thought unjust; for Collatinus had been his associate, and had helped him with word and deed in driving out the royal family. But when the leading men of the state had determined that all the kindred of Superbus, and the very name of the Tarquins, and every reminder of the monarchy should be obliterated, then the course that was expedient, namely, to serve the country's interests, was so preeminently right, that it was even Collatinus's own duty to acquiesce in its justice. And so expediency gained the day because of its moral rightness; for without moral rectitude there could have been no possible expediency. Not so in the case of the king, who founded the city. It was the specious appearance of expediency that actuated him; and when he decided that it was more expedient for him to reign alone than to share the throne with another, he slew his brother. He threw to the winds his brotherly affection and his human feelings, to secure what seemed to him, but was not, expedient. And yet, in defence of his deed, he offered the excuse about his wall, a specious show of moral rectitude, neither reasonable nor adequate at all. He committed a crime, therefore; with due respect to him, let me say so, be he Quirinus or Romulus. And yet we are not required to sacrifice our own interests, and surrender to others what we need for ourselves; but each one should consider his own interests as far as he may without injury to his neighbors. When a man enters the foot race, says Chrysippus with his usual aptness, it is his duty to put forth all his strength, and strive with all his might to win; but he ought never with his foot to trip, or with his hand to foul a competitor. Thus, in the stadium of life, it is not unfair for any one to seek to obtain what is needful for his own advantage, but he has no right to wrest it from his neighbor. It is in the case of friendships, however, that men's conceptions of duty are most confused; for it is a breach of duty either to fail to do for a friend what one rightly can do, or to do for him what is not right. But for our guidance in all such cases we have a rule that is short and easy to master: apparent advantages, political preferment, riches, sensual pleasures, and the like, should never be preferred to the obligations of friendship. But an upright man will never for a friend's sake do anything in violation of his country's interests, or his oath, or his sacred honor, not even if he sits as judge in a friend's case, for he lays aside the role of friend when he assumes that of judge. Only so far will he make concessions to friendship, that he will prefer his friend's side to be the juster one, and that he will set the time for presenting his case, as far as the laws will allow, to suit his friend's convenience. But when he comes to pronounce the verdict under oath, he should remember that he has God as his witness, that is, as I understand it, his own conscience, than which God himself has bestowed upon man nothing more divine. From this point of view, it is a fine custom that we have inherited from our forefathers, if we were only true to it now, to appeal to the juror with this formula, to do what he can consistently with his sacred honor. This form of appeal is in keeping with what I said a moment ago would be morally right for a judge to concede to a friend. For supposing that we were bound to do everything that our friends desired, such relations would have to be accounted not friendships, but conspiracies. But I am speaking here of ordinary friendships, for among men who are ideally wise and perfect, such situations cannot arise. They say that Damon and Phintius of the Pythagorean school enjoyed such ideally perfect friendship, that when the tyrant Dionysius had appointed a day for the execution of one of them, and the one who had been condemned to death requested a few days' respite for the purpose of putting his loved ones in the care of friends, the other became surety for his appearance, with the understanding that if his friend did not return, he himself should be put to death. And when the friend returned on the day appointed, the tyrant, in admiration for their faithfulness, begged that they would enroll him as a third partner in their friendship. Well, then, when we are weighing what seems to be expedient in friendship against what is morally right, let apparent expediency be disregarded, and moral rectitude prevail. And when in friendship requests are submitted that are not morally right, let conscience and scrupulous regard for the right take precedence of the obligations of friendship. In this way we shall arrive at a proper choice between conflicting duties. The subject of this part of our investigation. XI. Through a specious appearance of expediency, wrong is very often committed in transactions between state and state, as by our own country in the destruction of Corinth. A more cruel wrong was perpetrated by the Athenians in decreeing that the Aeginetans, whose strength lay in their navy, should have their thumbs cut off. This seemed to be expedient, for Aegina was too grave a menace, as it was close to the Piraeus. But no cruelty can be expedient, for cruelty is most abhorrent to human nature, whose leadings we ought to follow. They too do wrong who would debar foreigners from enjoying the advantages of their city, and would exclude them from its borders, as was done by Pennus in the time of our fathers, and in recent times by Poppius. It may not be right, of course, for one who is not a citizen to exercise the rights and privileges of citizenship, and the law on this point was secured by two of our wisest consuls, Crassus and Scaevola. Still, to debar foreigners from enjoying the advantages of the city is altogether contrary to the laws of humanity. There are splendid examples in history where the apparent expediency of the state has been set at naught out of regard for moral rectitude. Our own country has many instances to offer throughout her history, and especially in the Second Punic War, when news came of the disaster at Cannae. Rome displayed a loftier courage than ever she did in success. Never a trace of faint‐heartedness, never a mention of making terms. The influence of moral right is so potent that it eclipses the specious appearance of expediency. When the Athenians could in no way stem the tide of the Persian invasion, and determined to abandon their city, bestow their wives and children in safety at Treason, embark upon their ships, and fight on the sea for the freedom of Greece, a man named Cursilus proposed that they should stay at home, and open the gates of their city to Xerxes. They stoned him to death for it, and yet he was working for what he thought was expediency. But it was not, not at all, for it clashed with moral rectitude. After the victorious close of that war with Persia, Themistocles announced in the assembly that he had a plan for the welfare of the state, but that it was not politic to let it be generally known. He requested the people to appoint some one with whom he might discuss it. They appointed Aristides. Themistocles confided to him that the Spartan fleet, which had been hauled up on shore at Gutheium, could be secretly set on fire. This done, the Spartan power would inevitably be crushed. When Aristides heard the plan, he came into the assembly amid the eager expectation of all, and reported that the plan proposed by Themistocles was in the highest degree expedient, but anything but morally right. The result was that the Athenians concluded that what was not morally right was likewise not expedient, and at the instance of Aristides they rejected the whole proposition without even listening to it. Their attitude was better than ours, for we let pirates go scot free, while we make our allies pay tribute. 12. Let it be set down as an established principle, then, that what is morally wrong can never be expedient, not even when one secures by means of it that which one thinks expedient. For the mere act of thinking a course expedient, when it is morally wrong, is demoralizing. But, as I said above, cases often arise in which expediency may seem to clash with moral rectitude, and so we should examine carefully and see whether their conflict is inevitable, or whether they may be reconciled. The following are problems of this sort. Suppose, for example, a time of dearth and famine at Rhodes, with provisions at fabulous prices, and suppose that an honest man has imported a large cargo of grain from Alexandria, and that to his certain knowledge also several other importers have set sail from Alexandria, and that on the voyage he has sighted their vessels laden with grain and bound for Rhodes. Is he to report the fact to the Rhodians, or is he to keep his own counsel and sell his own stock at the highest market price? I am assuming the case of a virtuous, upright man, and I am raising the question how a man would think and reason who would not conceal the facts from the Rhodians if he thought that it was immoral to do so, but who might be in doubt whether such silence would really be immoral. In deciding cases of this kind, Diogenes of Babylonia, a great and highly esteemed Stoic, consistently holds one view; his pupil Antipater, a most profound scholar, holds another. According to Antipater, all the facts should be disclosed, that the buyer may not be uninformed of any detail that the seller knows. According to Diogenes, the seller should declare any defects in his wares, in so far as such a course is prescribed by the common law of the land. But for the rest, since he has goods to sell, he may try to sell them to the best possible advantage, provided he is guilty of no misrepresentation. I have imported my stock, Diogenes merchant will say. I have offered it for sale. I sell at a price no higher than my competitors, perhaps even lower, when the market is overstocked. Who is wronged? What say you? Comes Antipater's argument on the other side. It is your duty to consider the interests of your fellow men, and to serve society. You were brought into the world under these conditions, and have these inborn principles, which you are in duty bound to obey and follow, that your interest shall be the interest of the community, and conversely, that the interest of the community shall be your interest as well. Will you, in view of all these facts, conceal from your fellow men what relief in plenteous supplies is close at hand for them? It is one thing to conceal, Diogenes will perhaps reply. Not to reveal is quite a different thing. At this present moment I am not concealing from you, even if I am not revealing to you, the nature of the gods, or the highest good; and to know these secrets would be of more advantage to you than to know that the price of wheat was down. But I am under no obligation to tell you everything that it may be to your interest to be told. Yea, Antipater will say, but you are, as you must admit, if you will only bethink you of the bonds of fellowship forged by nature and existing between man and man. I do not forget them, the other will reply. But do you mean to say that those bonds of fellowship are such that there is no such thing as private property? If that is the case, we should not sell anything at all, but freely give everything away. 13. In this whole discussion, you see, no one says, however wrong morally this or that may be, still, since it is expedient, I will do it. But the one side asserts that a given act is expedient, without being morally wrong, while the other insists that the act should not be done because it is morally wrong. Suppose, again, that an honest man is offering a house for sale on account of certain undesirable features of which he himself is aware, but which nobody else knows. Suppose it is unsanitary, but has the reputation of being healthful. Suppose it is not generally known that vermin are to be found in all the bedrooms. Suppose, finally, that it is built of unsound timber and likely to collapse, but that no one knows about it except the owner. If the vendor does not tell the purchaser these facts, but sells him the house for far more than he could reasonably have expected to get for it, I ask whether his transaction is unjust or dishonorable. Yes, says Antipater, it is; for to allow a purchaser to be hasty in closing a deal, and through mistaken judgment to incur a very serious loss, if this is not refusing, to set a man right when he has lost his way, a crime which at Athens is prohibited on pain of public execration, what is? It is even worse than refusing to set a man on his way. It is deliberately leading a man astray. Can you say, answers Diogenes, that he compelled you to purchase when he did not even advise it? He advertised for sale what he did not like. You bought what you did like. If people are not considered guilty of swindling when they place upon their placards, for sale, a fine villa, well built, even when it is neither good nor properly built, still less guilty are they who say nothing in praise of their house. For where the purchaser may exercise his own judgment, what fraud can there be on the part of the vendor? But if, again, not all that is expressly stated has to be made good, do you think a man is bound to make good what has not been said? What, pray, would be more stupid than for a vendor to recount all the faults in the article he is offering for sale? And what would be so absurd as for an auctioneer to cry at the owner's bidding, here is an unsanitary house for sale? In this way, then, in certain doubtful cases, moral rectitude is defended on the one side, while on the other side the case of expediency is so presented as to make it appear not only morally right to do what seems expedient, but even morally wrong not to do it. This is the contradiction that seems often to arise between the expedient and the morally right. But I must give my decision in these two cases, for I did not propound them merely to raise the questions, but to offer a solution. I think, then, that it was the duty of that grain dealer not to keep back the facts from the Rhodians, and of this vendor of the house to deal in the same way with his purchaser. The fact is that merely holding one's peace about a thing does not constitute concealment; but concealment consists in trying for your own profit to keep others from finding out something that you know, when it is for their interest to know it. And who fails to discern what manner of concealment that is, and what sort of person would be guilty of it? At all events, he would be no candid, or sincere, or straightforward, or upright, or honest man, but rather one who is shifty, sly, artful, shrewd, underhand, cunning, one grown old in fraud and subtlety. Is it not inexpedient to subject one's self to all these terms of reproach, and many more besides? 14. If, then, they are to be blamed who suppress the truth, what are we to think of those who actually state what is false? Gaius Canius, a Roman knight, a man of considerable wit and literary culture, once went to Syracuse for a vacation, as he himself used to say, and not for business. He gave out that he had a mind to purchase a little country seat, where he could invite his friends and enjoy himself, uninterrupted by troublesome visitors. When this fact was spread abroad, one Pythias, a banker of Syracuse, informed him that he had such an estate; that it was not for sale, however, but Canius might make himself at home there if he pleased, and at the same time he invited him to the estate to dinner next day. Canius accepted. Then Pythias, who, as might be expected of a money lender, could command favors of all classes, called the fishermen together, and asked them to do their fishing the next day out in front of his villa, and told them what he wished them to do. Canius came to dinner at the appointed hour. Pythias had a sumptuous banquet prepared. There was a whole fleet of boats before their eyes. Each fisherman brought in turn the catch that he had made, and the fishes were deposited at the feet of Pythias. Pray, Pythias, said Canius thereupon, what does this mean? All these fish, all these boats? No wonder, answered Pythias. This is where all the fish in Syracuse are. Here is where the fresh water comes from. The fishermen cannot get along without this estate. Inflamed with desire for it, Canius insisted upon Pythias's selling it to him. At first he demurred. To make a long story short, Canius gained his point. The man was rich, and in his desire to own the country seat, he paid for it all that Pythias asked, and he bought the entire equipment too. Pythias entered the amount upon his ledger, and completed the transfer. The next day Canius invited his friends. He came early himself. Not so much as a thole pin was in sight. He asked his next door neighbor whether it was a fisherman's holiday, for not a sign of them did he see. Not so far as I know, said he, but none are in the habit of fishing here, and so I could not make out what was the matter yesterday. Canius was furious, but what could he do? For not yet had my colleague and friend Gaius Aquilius introduced the established forms to apply to criminal fraud. When asked what he meant by criminal fraud as specified in these forms, he would reply, pretending one thing and practising another. A very felicitous definition, as one might expect from an expert in making them. Pythias, therefore, and all others who do one thing while they pretend another, are faithless, dishonest, and unprincipled scoundrels. No act of theirs can be expedient, when what they do is tainted with so many vices. 15. But if Aquilius's definition is correct, pretense and concealment should be done away with in all departments of our daily life. Then an honest man will not be guilty of either pretense or concealment in order to buy or to sell to better advantage. Besides, your criminal fraud had previously been prohibited by the statutes. The penalty in the matter of trusteeships, for example, is fixed by the 12 tables, for the defrauding of minors by the Praetorian law. The same prohibition is effective, without statutory enactment, in equity cases, in which it is added that the decision shall be as good faith requires. In all other cases in equity, moreover, the following phrases are most noteworthy. In a case calling for arbitration in the matter of a wife's dowry, what is the fairer is the better. In a suit for the restoration of a trust, honest dealing as between honest parties. Pray, then, can there be any element of fraud in what is adjusted for the better and fairer? Or can anything fraudulent or unprincipled be done, when honest dealing between honest parties is stipulated? But criminal fraud, as Aquilius says, consists in false pretense. We must, therefore, keep misrepresentation entirely out of business transactions. The seller will not engage a bogus bidder to run prices up, nor the buyer one to bid low against himself to keep them down, and each, if they come to naming a price, will state once for all what he will give or take. Why, when Quintus Scaevola, the son of Publius Scaevola, asked that the price of a farm that he desired to purchase be definitely named, and the vendor named it, he replied that he considered it worth more, and paid him 100,000 sesterces over and above what he asked. No one could say that this was not the act of an honest man, but people do say that it was not the act of a worldly wise man, any more than if he had sold for a smaller amount than he could have commanded. Here then is that mischievous idea, the world accounting some men upright, others wise, and it is this fact that gives Ennius occasion to say, In vain is the wise man wise, who cannot benefit himself. And Ennius is quite right, if only he and I were agreed upon the meaning of benefit. Now I observe that Hecaton of Rhodes, a pupil of Panetius, says in his books on Moral Duty, dedicated to Quintus Tubero, that it is a wise man's duty to take care of his private interests, at the same time doing nothing contrary to the civil customs, laws, and institutions. But that depends on our purpose in seeking prosperity, for we do not aim to be rich for ourselves alone, but for our children, relatives, friends, and above all for our country. For the private fortunes of individuals are the wealth of the state. Hecaton could not for a moment approve of Scivola's act, which I cited a moment ago, for he openly avows that he will abstain from doing for his own profit only what the law expressly forbids. Such a man deserves no great praise nor gratitude. Be that as it may, if both pretense and concealment constitute criminal fraud, there are very few transactions into which criminal fraud does not enter. Or if he only is a good man who helps all he can, and harms no one, it will certainly be no easy matter for us to find the good man as thus defined. To conclude, then, it is never expedient to do wrong, because wrong is always immoral; and it is always expedient to be good, because goodness is always moral. End of Section 15.